want to say I'm honored to be asked to speak to you tonight, and I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Bruce Murphy for inviting me, to Vicki Wingfield for setting this all up, and a special thanks to Dr. Greg Bledsoe, who's been my good friend for many years. Okay, so tonight I'm going to take you on a trip to the highest mountain in the world. It's this one. Whoop, went backwards. Okay, so this is Mount Everest. It's 29,035 feet high. When you think about that, it's almost the cruising altitude of a transatlantic jet. It's one of the harshest, most remote environments in the world. I've made 6 trips to Mount Everest. 4 times I was with National Geographic doing tectonic plate measurements and measuring the true height of Everest. And then twice I went with NASA to test remote sensing devices to place on astronauts. It was on my 4th trip to Mount Everest that the comet Hyakutake passed over the mountain. And the Sherpas we were with all told us this was a bad omen. But we really didn't listen, and we continued on with our expedition. Later, about 2 months later on the mountain, as we were up near the summit, in our most vulnerable position on the mountain, a vicious storm hit Everest. It was the worst storm, and still is the worst storm ever recorded in human history on Mount Everest. It lasted 2 days, and during those 2 days, I was the only doctor high up on the mountain. The climb of Everest starts at base camp. It's 17,500 feet. It's the highest point you can bring yaks, so that's why we put the base camp there. That's base camp there. And from there, you climb 2,000 feet up what's called the Icefall, which is actually a frozen waterfall. And at the top of the Icefall, you place Camp 1. From there, it's another 2,000 feet up what's called the Western Khumbu, which is a kind of sloping snow valley, which goes just more gradually up than the Icefall, but a very long, long climb. To bring you from there, you have to climb the face of Lhotse. Lhotse is the 4th highest mountain in the world, but it's dwarfed by Everest next to it. But it's 5,000 feet of relentless ice, which is pitched at a 45-degree angle with virtually no breaks at all. So Camp 3 has to be built halfway up the Lhotse face because you can't climb it in one day. From there, we go across the Lhotse face, we traverse it, and put up Camp 4, which is in a saddle between the summit of Everest and the summit of Lhotse. And then from the summit days, from Camp 4, you have to go 3,000 feet up toward the summit and get back down, and that's summit day. All these camps have to be made as you go. There's nothing on the mountain if you don't bring it there and put it there. Everest is a really extreme environment. There's only about 1/3 as much oxygen on the summit as there is at sea level. So your metabolism can't really get going. It's like a smoldering fire that's not getting enough oxygen. So you can't generate enough heat to stay warm. You can't generate enough power to really move as quickly as you would like to. And it clouds your judgment. You can't think clearly either, all because of the low oxygen levels. Also, it's exhausting work, getting up there and staying up there. At sea level, you consume about 5% of your oxygen in the process of respiration. But up near the summit, you're consuming 60 to 70% of your oxygen just to breathe. So your heart is pounding even at rest. Then on summit day, you'll be out maybe 16 to 20 hours in temperatures could be minus 40 below zero. Winds could be 20 to 40 miles an hour very often. So that gives you a wind chill factor, which is actually equal to a summer day on Mars. And maybe all you've had to eat that morning is half a bowl of warm water, because it's hard to get supplies up there. And yet you're going to exhale about 2 gallons of water and burn about 15,000 calories. So you're really at the limit of survival when you're up near the summit of Everest. I remember on one of my expeditions, I was up near the summit, and I reached inside my down jacket to get a drink of water from my water bottle. The bottle was inside my down jacket, but yet when I pulled it out, the water inside was frozen. So that just gives you an idea of how much you're at the very limit of survival up there. And that was where the storm struck and the disaster occurred. This is base camp. It's set at 17,500 feet. It's already higher than any point in the contiguous United States. We put base camp there because it's the highest point you can bring your yaks with their supplies. It's the top of the Khumbu Glacier. We brought up our yaks to there, and they leave us there, and we have to set up camp because if you don't put it there, it's not there. There's nothing there except what you bring to the place. And as you can see here, it looks like there's debris over the field here. This kind of rocky debris. It's just, Everest is constantly shedding rocks, and since it's on top of a glacier, the rocks just settle down on top. But you can see on the right side of the picture what it's like. You're actually walking on ice with a very thin layer of rock over it. And we're here for 3 months. That's how long it takes to build your camps and run your expedition. Each of us has our own tent. This picture was taken from my tent, and it's the big tent and the big tan tent is our mess tent and supply tent. Each one of us has our own tents because for 3 months you really need to have some solitude. And this is me setting up my medical tent. Our expedition had 55 yaks, and I was assigned 4 yaks for my medical stuff. So I loaded 4 yaks with medical supplies, and when the yaks get to the top of the glacier, they just dump the supplies, and we set up a tent, and I have to sort out everything to make this into my medical tent. Okay, I was in the process of doing this. I was in the middle of setting up, and the place sort of looked like that. When I got the word that one of the Sherpas, who had been climbing up into the Icefall, the most dangerous part of the climb, had fallen and landed headfirst upside down in a crevasse. It had taken a half hour to get him out of the crevasse. And here he was brought to me. The report was that when he first got out of the crevasse, he was conscious, but then after a while, he was unable to walk, and then he just passed out completely. So I knew he had a subdural or a hematoma or something equivalent to that. When they brought him to me, though, his eyes were fixed and dilated. His pupils were not reacting. He didn't react even to painful stimuli. He looked like he was on the brink of death. I was thinking this guy's going to die even if he was brought to an ICU. But I sort of did what I could for him. I hung an IV. I gave him some fluids. I tried to reduce some of the swelling in his brain. He had a fractured skull. I tended for him overnight. I really didn't expect him to survive till the morning. But as I was taking care of him, the Sherpas that we had been working with came into the tent. They silently came into the tent, and they sat around the stone table that he was laying on, and they just started chanting. They started this deep, harmonious chant. It sounded like it was coming from deep within them. It didn't even sound like it was coming out of their mouths. This kind of quadraphonic sound was all around me. And it was hypnotic. It hypnotized me as well. And I was taking care of him through the night, and I remember I would look up and see an IV bag hanging, and I would say, oh, there's a new IV in there. And then I had to realize that I had just done that, you know, and then his oxygen was changed. And I sort of like was working so mechanically because I was under the spell of this incredibly hypnotic chant. And they kept us up all night long. And then in the morning, the Sherpa actually opened his eyes. He opened his eyes, looked around, and started yelling something in Tibetan. And I said, what's he saying? They said, he's cursing at you because you tied him down and he wants to get up. So this guy had not only survived, he had become completely conscious, very aware of his surroundings. We were able to evacuate him by helicopter. This was near the start of the expedition, the very beginning. And he was flown to Kathmandu, taken care of there, and he actually recovered so well that by the end of the expedition, he came back onto the mountain. I remember someone brought him to me and said, here's somebody who wants to meet you, and I had no idea who he was. And it turned out to be that same Sherpa I had taken care of 2 months earlier, completely recovered. And I really can't explain how that happened. It's almost a mystical kind of thing that somehow I truly believe that the chanting set up some kind of harmonic pattern in his brain or something which allowed him to regain energy and come back to life. It was a supernatural phenomenon for me. Okay, besides that experience, I was a busy doctor. There was a lot of injuries to take care of, a lot of sick people. This is me taking care of a Sherpa who had climbed through the Icefall. A block of ice fell on his ankle and broke it. Not all the injuries were that serious. This was a Sherpa who came to me complaining of severe stomach pain. And at first I thought I'm going to have to treat him for a rigid abdomen, appendicitis. All these things running through my mind. And then I found out that he had actually been in his tent the night before drinking a lot of chang, which is their moonshine that they make in the tents. You know, I don't allow my team to drink alcohol on the mountain because it makes it too hard to diagnose cerebral edema. But I can't stop the Sherpas. So this guy was having a few too many, and actually all he had to do was sleep it off, which was a big relief to me. All right, I was there with a NASA team, and we were testing space-age equipment. Our protocol was to put devices onto climbers and monitor their heart rate, their respiration, their skin temperature. We had them swallow pills which broadcast their body temperature in real time. We measured their O2 sat, and we put GPSs on them. And the idea was that we would send them up the mountain, and we could monitor them as they went up, see what kind of condition they were in. So this was something that NASA was very interested in, but also the Department of Defense was very interested in this because they thought this was a very, very good way to monitor soldiers in the field. If a soldier goes down and you want to see if he's alive or not and where he is, whether you should send out someone to try to rescue him, you could get all this information remotely. Plus, you could send it back to doctors, further back in the field who could give you some advice on how to treat them. And it was also practical for wilderness rescues, anybody out in the wilderness. So it had a tremendous amount of value to NASA and to many other organizations. So we were a very well-funded expedition. Here's one climber that we were testing out apparatus on. Compared to what we have now, this stuff looks really primitive. We were pasting these boxes on them and putting them on with duct tape. But that was our experiment with NASA that year. Then we'd collect all this data at base camp, and we'd be able to augment it. We could monitor heart sounds, breath sounds. We could do EKGs, sonograms, and we even had a digital microscope supplied by Olympus where we could take slide pictures and everything could be digitized. Then we would transmit this digital information in real time via satellite back to the United States, to Walter Reed Hospital and to Yale. And what we did was have telemedicine rounds with the doctors at Walter Reed and Yale. We would send them the information we had at their rounds. And when we knew it was coming up, we could ask them in advance to have experts on hand. If we needed to send them a slide, we could have a pathologist at the hospital reading the slide for us and giving us some information. We could call on a cardiologist to read an EKG for us. It was a real interaction of telemedicine on the other side of the world. The doctors all said this was by far the best attended Grand Round Series they ever had. And then we did a lot of live TV shows. We did the first ever broadcast from base camp at Mount Everest, a live interview on Nightline. We did a lot of other shows also. This was a real challenge to do this kind of thing because of the time change and because of the idea that they all wanted this done outdoors because it looked better on TV. We had to do these things at 4 a.m. in the freezing cold. I always felt like if I could do that, then I could do any kind of public speaking. Okay, so after 2 months of setting up experiments and building our camps up the mountain, we were ready to start up Everest to try to make a summit. This is a view taken from base camp. This is after 2 months of acclimatization. You can see the camp at the bottom and the Icefall looming above for 2,000 feet. The camp one, the first camp, would be up here, right at the top of the icefall. This was our team. It was put together by the Explorers Club, and it consisted of scientists from MIT and engineers, computer engineers, and climbers that we recruited to go on this mission. Besides our expedition, there were 3 other expeditions. There was Scott Fisher's American team, there was Rob Hall's New Zealand team, and there was an IMAX team that had come to film a scripted movie. Those were the major expeditions on the mountain. So we start off in the Icefall. This is really a frozen waterfall. It actually moves, but it moves very, very slowly. You can hear it move as you climb through it. You hear the cracking and the creaking. As the angle of the ice changes, you get these huge openings called crevasses, which are tremendous cracks in the ice. And you have to negotiate your way through this, and all around it, it's really like, you feel like a rat in a maze because you can't see over the top. So over the past 2 months, our lead climbers have been, and the Sherpas have been building a route, so to speak, through this, which changes every day because the ice moves every day. So here we are trying to get our way through this icefall, 2,000 feet. And this is up near the top of the icefall. It's near Camp 1. You can see the sun is just starting to come up. We make this climb through the icefall in the middle of the night because you have overhanging blocks of ice the size of buildings, which are ready to fall on you if the ice cracks. So you want to go through when it's as cold as possible. So you go through at night with headlights on. These climbers are making it right through the icefall. They're up near the top, and the sun's just coming up, so they're in pretty good shape. Okay, here's a picture of me climbing through the icefall. You get the idea of how you do this. These crevasses are bridged with aluminum ladders that are sometimes held together, screwed together, and you're wearing a harness and a helmet, and the harness is tied into safety ropes, which are independently screwed into the ice on either side, so that if you fall, you're not going to hopefully fall any further than your safety rope. It's really tricky because it's very windy, so you have to sort of counterbalance against the wind by leaning way over your ladder, and then all of a sudden the wind will stop, and then you find yourself like hanging way over the side. But you managed to get through these. This is one crevasse. There was literally hundreds of crevasses. Here's one that's at least 10 stories high. This is my climbing partner going over the top of it, and he says that the reason we climb at night is not to keep the ice frozen. It's because we can't see what we're doing. Because if we ever saw it, we would never do it. Okay, as you get higher up in the icefall, the crevasses get wider, and this one is one that was bridged by 5 different ladders. We had to tie 5 ladders together to do this, plus put some guy ropes from side to stop it from swaying, and we have climbers on either side sort of holding it together. When you climb down into one of these things, it's like going out to the end of a diving board. As you get toward the middle, the ladders, your weight pushes the ladder way down, so you wind up sort of going down almost to the bottom of the crevasse, and then as you keep climbing, you come back up the other side. Some of the crevasses are just so big that you can't bridge them with ladders, so you have to climb down into it and then back up on the other side. Okay, this is a picture taken at the top of the icefall. This is where we put Camp 1. It's the first flat spot on top, at the top of the icefall. You're 2,000 feet higher now. You're about 19,500 feet. And you see we're setting up tents here. This is an early shot because later on we build an ice wall around here. It's a beautiful spot, but it's cold and it's very windy. So to block the wind, you sort of make an ice fall like half an igloo, just to protect yourself while you're there. From Camp 1 now, we're moving up through the Western Khumbu. This is another 2,000 feet. It's called the Western Khumbu, but it's just like a snow valley. The ice is it's like ice dunes. You go up and down a dune, up and down the next one, the next one. It's not as steep as the ice fall, but it's just sort of endless. You just 2,000 feet of relentless kind of just stepping up over one dune after another. And that brings you to Camp 2. This is Camp 2. On the right side, you see there the rock. There's very few places on Everest that are actually not covered with ice. This is a lateral moraine that has exposed rock, which makes it a little bit warmer, and a little bit less unstable. And it's flat. So we put Camp 2 there. This is now 19,500 feet. This is the last place where you can make a reasonable camp that you can sort of hang out in for a little bit if necessary. From here, it's another 8,000 feet to the summit of Everest. And if weather is good, you can make it in 3 days. But if weather is not good, there's really no place to hang out higher up on the mountain to endure any kind of bad weather. So at this point, you have to sort of check the weather and make your decision as to whether or not you want to try to move up from this point. We rely very heavily on the Sherpas here because, at least at that time, there was no weather forecasting in this area whatsoever. You could never get a weather forecast. We'd be really freezing, and we'd listen to the radio, and they would say, another pleasant day in the kingdom, you know, because no one was paying attention to what was going on the mountain. So we relied on the Sherpas. They would stick their nose out of the tent and just sort of smell the air and say yes or no, and you know, they knew, and we would just follow their advice for sure. Anyway, we were up at Camp 2. We were a day behind Scott Fisher's American team and Rob Hall's New Zealand team. And the weather started to look good, and Rob and Scott both decided that this was a day that they were going to go for it. I don't know if we would have gone for it, but we weren't ready, so we had to hang back another day anyway. Okay, so here's going from Camp 2 up on the Lhotse face, that 5,000-foot sheer 45-degree angle face. And you can see the climbers coming up on the face. We have what we call fixed ropes at this point. Ropes are anchored into the ice every 250 feet. And as you climb up, you clip yourself into the rope so that if you fall 250 feet, which is bad enough, but it's better than falling 5,000 feet. So you climb up these fixed ropes, which had been set during your expedition earlier on. Here are some climbers coming up the Lhotse face, moving toward Camp 3. Camp 2 is over here. This is where we left it. And Camp 1 would be at the top of the Icefall over here. This is a picture taken at Camp 3. It's just halfway up Lhotse. You're at 24,000 feet now. And you can see it's a little bit in profile. You get an idea of the sheer angle, the 45-degree angle of Lhotse on the right. And if you notice, if you look up toward the summit of Everest, you see there's no snow there. And the reason there's no snow there is because this is in the jet stream. It's so high that it's constantly scoured by jet stream winds. And the face of Everest at this point can't hold the snow. It just gets blown right off. What looks like a cloud over the summit ridge is in fact just snow blowing up off the top. From Camp 3 now, we're doing that traverse across the Lhotse face, traversing from Camp 3 to Camp 4, the highest camp. At this point, we're all on oxygen, and again, we have ropes, fixed ropes that you can sort of see here. They're already getting buried in the snow, and we're moving up literally into the clouds to get to Camp 4. This is a view taken on the approach to Camp 4. We're almost there. This is the top of the Lhotse face here. These are the tents that we put on previous runs up to the top of Camp 4. And again, you have on the right, you have Lhotse going up that way, and on the left, you have the summit of Everest. This is the last highest camp, and it's from here you're going to have to make your move to the summit. You get to Camp 4 in the afternoon, and you still have 3,000 feet to go, and you have to make a decision at this point whether or not you're going to go up or not that night, because you don't have much in the way of supplies. Your oxygen supply is very limited, your food is limited. It's 26,000 feet. It's a very uncomfortable, windy place. It's not the kind of place you can hang out. So you have to assess the weather at this point and decide either you're going to go for the summit that night or you're going to back down. So everybody's watching the wind. There's a couple of climbers in the tent here resting. And we brought up some oxygen with us. Oxygen's limited, but you need to have oxygen to sort of get some kind of rest, to get some kind of, build some kind of strength for what's coming ahead. So here's a couple of climbers in the tent, just sort of resting, waiting for dark, actually, to see if they're going to climb or not. This is a picture of Rob Hall, the New Zealand team leader. It's a picture of him taken on his phone, on his radio, and this was actually the last picture ever taken of Rob. Okay, this is Yasuko Namba. She was a famous Japanese climber. She had summited the highest peaks on every continent except Asia, and this was her attempt to climb to the summit of Everest, be the first female Japanese climber to do that. She's standing outside the tent and looking at the summit, and as you can see, there's a lot of snow blowing off the top of the summit. So this is like a no-go situation. It's way too windy to try to climb Everest. But a couple hours later, it became very calm. The wind dissipated. It was very calm and still on the mountain. There was virtually no snow plume coming off the top. So this appeared to be a perfect summit night. On that last dash to the summit, the first part is on what's called the triangular face. It's not as sheer as what's coming next. So what climbers do is start out about midnight on this part of the climb, because this can be done in the dark. You put on headlights, and you can negotiate this part of the climb in the dark, and that saves you the daylight hours. So here are climbers moving up the triangular face, moving toward the summit, just sort of in the dark as it's starting to get light. You try to time this so that you get to the southeast ridge, the last part of the summit climb, just as the sun's coming up. If you get there too quickly, it's still dark, and then you have to sort of stand around and wait for the sun to come up because you can't really negotiate the southeast ridge in the dark. If you get there too late, then you've lost daylight hours. So you try to time it to hit the ridge just at sunrise, and that's exactly what happened here. These climbers have hit the ridge at the right time and taken a couple of minutes rest, maybe having a piece of a chocolate bar and a drink of water or something, and then getting ready to move on up the southeast ridge, which is here. The southeast ridge is the last 1,500 feet to the summit. It's kind of a knife edge. It's a very tricky route to get past this 1,500 feet. It angles up at an average of about 30 degrees toward the summit. It's also tilted left to right about 15 degrees, and it's sinuous. It's not a straight path by any means. The top of the crest of the mountain sort of winds its way up. And when you have snow on the ground, which you always do, it's sometimes very hard to see where to put your feet. So you have to go very, very carefully. You put your foot down, you make sure there's something under it before you take the next step, which is why you proceed very slowly through these last 1,500 feet. And then to make it even more complicated, you're up where the clouds are, and the clouds are passing through you. And every time a cloud comes through you, you can't see anything at all. So you have to wait until the cloud passes to take your next step. So it's a very arduous, meticulous, slow-moving, and dangerous process to move that last 1,500 feet. All right, while a lot of the climbers were up in that area, trying to negotiate that really tricky 1,500 feet, the winds picked up. No one really expected this storm. It really came out of nowhere. But the wind started to pick up, and at this point, some of the climbers turned around, and some of them wanted to continue on toward the summit. It's very hard to turn around at this point because you've been planning this expedition at least a year, if not more. You've been on the mountain 3 months, and in good conditions, you could be on the summit in another 2 or 3 hours. So there's this tremendous, what we call pull to the left. Everybody's drawn toward the summit of Everest, and they sort of think, well, I can push it a little bit more, and I can do this. And also at this height, your judgment is kind of clouded, so sometimes you don't make the right decisions. Some of the climbers turned back, and others did not, and they continued on through the summit even as the wind was building. This is a picture of me taken in that place a year earlier. This is when I was on one of my summit attempts, but I put this picture in so that you get an idea of what it was like for those climbers at that time. Up on this, that's me in the foreground here. We're completely covered head to toe with face masks, goggles. We have oxygen masks on with rebreathers. In our backpacks, we have almost nothing, maybe beside 2 oxygen cylinders, which are connected with a hose up to the oxygen mask. And beside that, maybe you have an extra pair of gloves and a chocolate bar, and a water bottle, and that's really all you have up there, because you want to go as light as you possibly can. So this is what those climbers would be looking like at that point when the wind picked up and they were caught in it. This is a view taken looking down from the direction of the summit, looking back down toward the southeast ridge. So these climbers in the foreground are moving up toward the summit of Everest, and the climbers are back this way, coming in this direction. And as you can see, the climbers are spread out. They're all unroped at this point, because the drop-off is so sheer at this point that if you fell off the mountain or slipped, you would just wind up pulling another climber off with you. It's too sheer. It's a free fall, and you don't want to pull anybody off with you. It's bad enough if you're going to go off the edge, but you don't want to bring anybody with you. So we unrope at this point, and everybody climbs by themselves. Everybody's on their own. So you climb very carefully. You're completely unprotected at this point. If you fall off to your left side, you're going to fall 8,000 feet into Tibet. If you fall to your right side, you're going to fall 12,000, got that wrong. If you fall to the left, you fall 8,000 feet into Nepal. If you fall to the right, you fall 12,000 feet into Tibet. So it's better to fall into Tibet because you'll live longer. But either way, you fall for the rest of your life, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, well, while these climbers were up there on the southeast ridge in the storm conditions, my team, with my NASA National Geographic team, we were 2,000 feet below them at Camp 3. And we were listening for how they were doing. We could hear on the radio how they were progressing up the mountain. And Rob Hall radioed back that he had reached the summit. And we could hear down below in the New Zealand base camp, we heard champagne corks popping and people celebrating and cheering, but they weren't really aware of what was going on like we were. Rob had summited at 2:30 in the afternoon, which is a very late time to be summiting Everest. You really don't want to be anywhere but on your way down after noon. So it was a very late time. They had cut their safety margin quite short. There weren't that many hours of daylight left. Rob had summited along with 3 others, but there were 8 members of his team, which we had no idea what had happened to them. They hadn't summited. We had no word on them whatsoever. Scott Fisher's American team they weren't carrying radios. We had no idea what was going on with their team. And the winds were picking up and up and up. And, when you get to the summit of Everest, you're only halfway there. You have to get back down. What climbers like to say is getting to the top is optional, but getting back down is essential. So they're in a precarious position late on the summit with the storm brewing. Winds were picking up. It was getting windy even where we were. So we spent hours just sort of looking at our radios and hoping we would hear the next message that everyone had gotten back safely to Camp 4. In fact, we got the chilling report that Rob was still up near the summit. The summit up here. He was up in this area right up here. This is what's called the Hillary Step. It's a rock face, which is very near the summit. Under what you would say normal climbing conditions, it's a medium level climb. It's not really that hard, but when you're wearing ice boots and you've been out for 16 hours and it's below 0 temperature and you're exhausted, this becomes a very, very difficult climb. Particularly descending this rock face is very difficult. So Rob had radioed that he was up at the top of that Hillary Step, and he was not coming down yet because he was with another climber, Doug Hansen, who was one of Rob's teammates, much weaker than Rob. And Doug was out of oxygen, and he was too weak to make it down the Hillary Step. So Rob was staying with him. We also had no idea what was going on with the rest of the New Zealand team, and we had no idea at all about Scott Fisher's team. And there was another climber, a Taiwanese climber, who had also gone for the summit, and we had no idea where he was. We stayed in our tents at Camp 3, you see down at the bottom there, and received all these radio reports. They were all confusing Most of them were conflicting. Besides Rob, his lead guide, Andy Harris, guides Andy Harris and Mike Groom were not heard from. Scott Fisher was not heard from. Yasuko Namba, the Japanese climber, had been reported that she had summited, but no one knew where she was now. And Beck Weathers, an American climbing with the New Zealand team, had not summited, had not returned to camp, and no one knew where he was. John Krakauer, who was part of the New Zealand team, who wrote Into Thin Air later, had gotten back down to Camp 4 and was in a tent. And he said that he couldn't see outside his tent. There was a complete whiteout. The wind had whipped up the snow to the point where you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. So he couldn't see outside his tent, but what that also meant was that the climbers trying to find their way back to Camp 4 would not be able to find it. They wouldn't be able to see it. There were in total 18 climbers that we could not account for. And it got dark. Night came on. That storm raged all night long. Throughout the whole night, there was the winds were so loud, it was like a freight train going through the tent. Our camp, Camp 3, our tents at Camp 3, we had two tents, maybe not more than a yard apart. But the noise was so loud that we couldn't even communicate by shouting from one tent to the other. We had to talk on the radio, even though we're a couple of yards apart. It was just a deafening freight train kind of noise the entire night. And in the morning, the storm was still going on, and our two strongest climbers, that's Todd Burleson and Pete Atkins, our two strongest climbers, one in each tent, got on the radio, and I was struck by the fact that the first words out of their mouths were, "How quickly can you get ready?" There wasn't one thought, there wasn't one comment about whether they should go or not. It was just absolutely not even an issue that they wouldn't try to make a rescue. So these two climbers got together and actually went out into this maelstrom of a storm and went up to make their way toward Camp 4 to try to see who they could rescue. We had no Sherpas with us up at that camp. The Sherpas were at a lower camp. And we radioed back down to ask the Sherpas to come back up and help. And the Sherpas refused. And there are no people braver and stronger than Sherpas. They said they didn't come up because it was too windy, they wouldn't come up, but we really knew the reason they wouldn't come up is because they're deeply Buddhist, and the idea of seeing dead bodies lying along the route was it just spooked them too much, and they just couldn't come up, they just couldn't do it. So just before Todd and Pete left to go up to Camp 4, they sent a message to Rob. And Rob was at the top of the Hillary Step with Doug Hansen. Their message was to Rob, I expected him to say something like, "Hang on, Rob, we're coming to get you." But what they said to Rob was, "Abandon Doug. There's no chance for the two of you to get down alive. Abandon Doug and save yourself." Todd and Pete got to the cove. This is taken from Camp 3. Picture, this is the Lhotse face up to the top, Camp 4 up in this area here. So in the middle of the storm, those guys made it up to the top. And they radioed back to me a scene of complete chaos. They said the tents were ripped, shredded. There was gear strewn everywhere. People who had made it back were in whatever tent they could get into, not their own tents. So they didn't know where they couldn't tell who was really back and who wasn't because everybody was in the wrong place. Two climbers had come down and reported that they had passed Beck Weathers lying in the snow. And they said he was dead. They said they found Beck dead in the snow. And other people were missing, people in the wrong tents. They reported that there was severe cases of frostbite, hypothermia, some cerebral edema. These guys, Todd and Pete, were really experienced climbers, so they knew a lot what to do. And I was helping them from Camp 3 over the radio as best as I could. This is Camp 3. This is where I was. So I could radio advice from here, but you can't treat anybody at Camp 3. This is halfway up the Lhotse face. It's 24,000 feet up. to make the camp, it's such a sheer, relentless slope that what you have to do is you just sort of cut into the ice like this and like that and make a shelf and put your tent on the shelf and then tie yourself in with ice screws, tie your tent in with ice screws. It's such a dangerous place. You have to rope up even just to go to the bathroom. And there were cases of people not doing that and actually falling and dying. You can barely stand up. It's very cold. And the only medical supplies I had up there were 2 Ziploc bags. One of them had preloaded syringes of Demerol, and one of them had preloaded syringes of dexamethasone. And I figured that would be the only thing I could use at that height in those kind of conditions. So I was keeping in radio contact with Todd and Beck as they were trying to bring around some of these climbers who had staggered back into camp. Todd was working to help one of the climbers, and he looked outside his tent, and he saw a climber sort of staggering around outside there. And he thought it was one of the climbers who had made it back and was trying to go out to urinate. So Todd went out to help him urinate, and to his total amazement, he saw that it was Beck Weathers. Beck had been left for dead, laying in the snow. He was reported dead. It was, we were sure he was dead, but he wasn't. Beck was alive, and he had staggered close to the camp, and Todd had pulled him in, and now they were working on trying to revive Beck. And the Taiwanese climber, Makalu Gao, was also found out lying in the snow, and he was dragged into Camp 4 also. So the 2 of them were in really critical condition. The other climbers had various degrees of frostbite and hypothermia and cerebral edema. And our plan was to try to get these people off the mountain as quickly as possible, which meant descending from up here, from Camp 4, all the way down, at least to me, at Camp 3. But I couldn't really do much for them at Camp 3. They would have to get down to Camp 2, where we had more supplies and where I could actually do some work with them. So the climbers who, by triage, we thought were capable of moving on their own, Todd and Pete sent down the mountain. They would come past me at Camp 3. Beck and Makalu, we decided were in no condition to make that descent, so they would have to stay another night at 26,000 feet. So here they are. The climbers would be coming past me at Camp 3. I would try to assess their condition. All I had to work with was the frozen Demerol and the frozen dexamethasone. So, and there's no heater up there. So what I had to do was put this stuff inside my jacket under my arm to defrost it. And once I got it defrosted, as the climbers came down past me, I could assess them a little bit. If I thought they had some cerebral edema, I could inject them with the dexamethasone. And I would do it just right through their clothes. There was no niceties about rolling up your sleeve in an alcohol pad. You just gave the injection right through whatever clothes, because it was just so hard to do anything up there. And that was critical for a lot of climbers, because with the cerebral edema, they couldn't really coordinate well. They couldn't think that clearly, they couldn't coordinate that well. Once they got the steroid in them, their brain shrank for a while, and it suddenly cleared them up. They suddenly snapped to, they were better coordinated, they could think clearly, they knew what they had to do, and then we could send them on down the mountain. We give them at least a couple of hours of a lucid interval, which hopefully would be enough time to get them past me from Camp 3 down to Camp 2. Meanwhile, we got word from Rob. He had radioed back. His ordeal continued. He was unreachable up there, as if he was on the moon. There was no way we could get to him. He had gotten that message that Todd and Pete had sent to abandon Doug and come but down himself, but his response to that message had been, "We're both listening." So it was clear that he wasn't going to abandon Doug. In the morning, Rob got back on the radio, and it was clear that he was alone now, that Doug had died overnight. Some of the Sherpas had come up at this point and tried to mount a rescue to get to Rob, but the wind was too strong. They started up the southeast ridge, but had to turn back. They could not get near him. So we radioed to Rob that no rescue was coming, and Rob knew what that meant. He has to be patched into his wife, who was home in New Zealand, 7 months pregnant with their first child. And he was patched in by radio and spoke to her on the phone. They named their baby, and then Rob signed off. He said, I need to rest. And that was the last we ever heard from Rob. Okay, in the morning, Beck and Makalu had survived that night at 26,000 feet, and they were going to be, some rescuers, Todd and Pete, were going to bring them down to me at Camp 2, because I couldn't do much at Camp 3. So Camp 3 is up in this area here. Camp 2 is down here. So it's 3,000 feet down. So I down climbed 3,000 feet to meet my patients. This is a shot taken at Camp 2. It's, as I said before, it's a much flatter place. It's a little bit warmer. It's a place where you can deploy more equipment. As you go up to each camp, you take less and less stuff. And I didn't have really that much at 21,000 feet. But what I did was I asked the Sherpas to bring up more supplies. Ordinarily, you don't bring much through the icefall because it's so dangerous. But this was kind of an emergency situation. The Sherpas were the unsung heroes here because I asked them to bring up heavy medical equipment and propane heaters, things you never bring through the icefall. But they did it willingly and voluntarily, of course, to try to give me the best shot I had at saving these two climbers. So I was awaiting my patients here. This is what I had at Camp 2 before the Sherpas brought this stuff. This is a fishing tackle box. This is what I bring through the icefall with my absolute emergency medical supplies. So this is what was being augmented by the Sherpas that were bringing up all these other supplies for me. This is the New Zealand mess tent. This was the biggest tent in Camp 2. This picture was taken in happier times, but it was the biggest tent in the Camp 2 area. So we cleared out this tent with a lot of help. We cleared everything out. I had Sherpas helping me. I had other climbers helping me. I had a lot of help here. We laid foam mats on the floor. We laid sleeping bags on top of that. We collected dry clothes. I hung IV bags through carabiners, which are like climbing hooks, into the tent frame and hung the IV bags from those. I put out oxygen bottles with regulators, laid out bandages, medications, and I had the Sherpas boiling up as much hot water as they could. We had fuel. Now we had a propane heater, so we were heating up some water. And I was waiting for my two patients to arrive, and I listened by radio as to how they were doing. And actually, I had some tea because we had so much water. And I tried to stay focused, which is something which is very hard to do at 21,000 feet. It's I liken it to tying your shoes. When you're at sea level, you can tie your shoes without thinking about it. When you're at 21,000 feet, you can tie your shoes, but you have to think about it. You got to say, okay, here's a loop, here's another loop, this one goes here. You know, you're sort of out of it in the sense that you're moving very slowly, but you know you're slow, so you can sort of compensate for it. So there I am trying to stay focused and waiting for these two critically ill patients to arrive. And Makalu arrived first. He came in, he was brought in by two of the rescuers, and we immediately laid him down on the sleeping bag and the mat. He was wearing a down suit, and we immediately started to take his clothes off, put an oxygen mask on his face. And here we are taking his clothes off. He was wet down to his underwear. We had to get him into dry clothes. And I started an IV. He had the worst frostbite I had ever seen. I've treated a lot of frostbite. He had the worst frostbite I'd ever seen. His fingers were gray, like gray stones, and they actually radiated cold. The tent was 0 degrees. And when I held Makalu's hand up to my face, I could feel the cold radiating off his hand, even in that 0 degree tent. And his feet were completely frozen, not completely frozen, they were frozen. Here I am cutting away a piece of a sock that was stuck to his foot. And you can see here the demarcation line of severe frostbite off his toes and his heels. He had very severe frostbite, toes, hands and feet. And I checked to see if he had pulses. His feet were alive. He had pedal pulses. And I was able to mark him with a curious onlooker looking over my shoulder here, so I can keep track of his pulses. This was his nose. It was a completely burned out, frozen, brittle crust. I was checking his eyes to see if he could see, and I found that he could see, but he had snow blindness in one eye. I started an IV and gave him nifedipine with the idea of increasing some flow into his hands and feet. But as you know, nifedipine can lower the core temperature, the core blood pressure, and I didn't have a blood pressure cuff. So I kept track of his blood pressure as best I could by just feeling his carotid artery pulsations periodically. And we put him back on oxygen and fed him some soup. This is something I didn't think of at all, but these guys hadn't eaten in 3 days. It didn't even occur to me, but luckily there were people there who did think of that, and they got together and heated up some soup. Here's Miraculous being fed some soup. You can see how edematous his face is here. Then after a few hours, the edema really subsided, almost magically. The edema left his face, and he started to come around somewhat. Okay, so I put his feet in tubs of warm water to try to thaw him out, ideally maintaining a temperature of 104 degrees, which is extremely difficult to do when the tent is 0 degrees. Plus, the hands and feet are like blocks of ice. So the minute you get the right temperature, they put their hand or foot in there, the temperature drops very rapidly. So I had little thermometers, these little plastic thermometers I had in each basin to try to monitor the temperature. The Sherpas had never seen those kind of thermometers before, but we just told them what to, how to take care of this, and the Sherpas did a great job. Right away they understood that how many dots had to be on the little thermometer, and they could add hot water and they could take off the cold water to try to maintain that temperature as best they could. They were titrating the hot and the cold. It was a lot of work. I needed a lot of help for that and a lot of boiling water. The decision to thaw out Makalu is not as easy as people often think it is. You can't just reflexly start to thaw somebody out. We had a patient here who was hypothermic, and if you just start to thaw out his extremities without raising his body temperature at an equal rate, you're going to wind up defrosting his hands, liquefying cold blood, which is then going to travel, which is then going to travel to his heart, and the heart's going to be stiff because it's at low temperature, and you can easily throw him into an arrhythmia. And there are cases reported of climbers surviving their hypothermia outdoor exposure only to die while they're being thawed out. So it's a very important decision to make. It's not whether or not you can thaw these people out, because number one, I got to be sure I can bring their body temperature up simultaneously, and number two, if you have a frozen body part and you thaw it out and it refreezes, it's much worse than if you left it frozen straight through. The process of thawing out and refreezing destroys more capillaries and leads to a much worse outcome than if you left them frozen the whole time. But here I was at Camp 2. I was at 21,000 feet. I had a lot of help. I had a lot of propane fuel. We had a lot of extra clothes, and I figured I could bring these guys around at 21,000 feet and felt confident that I could maintain them in a warmed condition once we got them going. So just as we're getting Makalu under control, Beck arrives. Beck, I was expecting an incoherent phantom to be carried in, but actually he came in on his own feet with a climber holding him up under each arm. I thought he'd be incoherent, but he walks in, he looks around, and he says, "Hi, Ken, where should I sit?" So this was great to hear that. So we moved Makalu off to one side, laid Beck down next to him on another sleeping bag, and as soon as he got down on the sleeping bag, the next thing he said to me was, "Do you accept my insurance?" So that was besides being funny, it was great, because that meant he was oriented and he was at least mentally in good shape. Makalu had the worst frostbite I'd ever seen, but that was before I saw Beck's frostbite. Beck's hands were purple. His right forearm was frozen solid up to the midpoint. His face and nose were black, and on his hands, he had no blisters. He had, and as you might know, you need a live nerve to form a blister. If you can't even form a blister, your nerve is dead. He had no blisters. He had no pulse in his hands. He could feel no sensation, no pain. It was like the hand of a dead man. But oddly enough, when I asked him to move his fingers, he could do it because the muscles in his forearm were still alive. So he didn't even know he was doing it, but he would say to me, am I moving it? He was moving his hands. It was really bizarre to see this dead hand moving. Well, I followed the same routine for Beck as I had followed for Makalu. And while I was doing this, Beck just talked casually. If you had just heard us talk and not seen the scene, you would have thought Beck just stopped by for tea. He said his vision had gotten blurry up near the summit, and he turned around, realizing that he was in no shape to continue. But his vision continued to worsen, and he got lost up in the whiteout and the very poor blurry vision he was having. He realized that he was in very heavy trouble, and his hands were freezing. He took his glove off to put it inside his jacket to try to warm it up, put his hand inside his jacket to warm it up. And before he actually got it inside, he collapsed in the snow. So he laid down in the snow. He says he wasn't unconscious. He was just laying there, unable to move. And he laid there a day, a night, and another day in this frozen condition, getting colder and colder, the winds and the snow and everything else, in this hypothermic condition, unable to move. And then he said he heard 2 climbers come by and say, he's dead. And Beck was unable to even blink or do anything to show these guys that he was alive. And the climbers went on past him. And at that point, Beck got into survival mode, which is something I talk about a lot. He realized that the only way he's going to survive is if he saves himself. And he started thinking about what he had to return to, his family and his life before he was on the mountain, how much more he had to live for. And that generated enough emotion in Beck to give him the energy to stand up. Beck stood up, and he still couldn't see, but he was lucid enough, his brain cleared up enough for him to think that when he was climbing, he was going with the wind at his back. So now, if he had any chance of getting back to the camp, he would have to face into the wind, which I think is absolutely remarkable thought process given the condition he was in. So he turned and faced into the wind and started staggering forward, looking for Camp 4 with his very blurry vision. He said he saw some blue rocks, and he headed toward the blue rocks. And those blue rocks turned out to be the tents of Camp 4. And there he was outside the tent, staggering toward it, when Todd took him for somebody who wanted to urinate and went out and brought him into the camp. Beck had really saved himself. We stabilized him that night. I started an IV, I warmed him up, and stayed with him and with Makalu all night. But I couldn't help thinking what I was doing for Beck was nothing compared to what Beck had done for himself. Beck had really saved himself. So we had IVs going, I had oxygen going, I was watching him breathe the whole night. The IV bags that you hang up, I had put chemical hand warmers around so they wouldn't freeze. But even so, I had to alternate the IV bags because I had to keep some hot pots with the IV bags, and I would change them every 15 minutes so the bags wouldn't freeze. I was doing all that work, and I was sort of hoping for a helicopter rescue. We were at 21,000 feet. These guys were in critical condition. I really wanted to get them out of here. Then at 4 o'clock in the morning, we got word from the helicopter pilot that he could not come in. He could not come to us because the winds were way too strong. He couldn't risk coming in at 21,000 feet. Plus, the helicopter was only rated to 19,000 feet. So he said he would not be able to come in and get us, at least not till the wind quieted down. So there I had another very tough decision to make. What do I do with these 2 guys? It's the second day now. We're at 21,000 feet, a height where cuts won't even heal. And I had 2 critically ill climbers that really needed to get out of there. So I had the choice of either trying to wait out the storm another day or 2 and hope that things will quiet down and the helicopter can come in, or I could call for an over-the-ice rescue. That would mean bundling up these climbers, putting them on ladders, and dragging them down the western Khumbu and then down the Icefall. And it wouldn't be me who was doing it. It would be our best climbers. So I would be putting our best climbers at risk, not to mention the patients. I'd be putting our rescuers at significant risk of injury coming down the Icefall with these two patients. But I had to make a choice, and I knew whatever I chose would be instantly agreed to. I was the only doctor up there, and climbers are very altruistic, you know, and they want to save other climbers whether they know them or not. It's part of the spirit of being a climber. So I knew whatever I said wouldn't even be a question. But looking at these two guys, these two patients who were in such critical condition and not knowing how long this wind would go, it was already over 2 days, I called for the over-the-ice evacuation. So the climbers were bundled up in heavy clothes and laid out on ladders to use as stretchers, sort of, and we started off down the western Khumbu, down toward Camp 1. And I was thinking so much about how I'm going to take care of these climbers once we get down past the Icefall back to base camp that I didn't realize that the wind had died down. And I heard this noise. And at that time on Everest, there was never any loud noises. There was no machines, there was no generators, there was no nothing. So you had 3 months of absolutely no machine noise. And all of a sudden, I heard this really loud machine noise. And for a second, I didn't know what that was. And I looked up, and I saw the helicopter was coming in. And then I realized there was a lull in the wind. The pilot was literally risking his life to come in during this lull to try to pick up these climbers. And the helicopter was only rated to 17,000 feet. And here he was coming in at 21,000 feet, 4,000 feet above the ceiling limit of his helicopter. But what he was doing was he was using prop wash. He was coming in very low over the ice, and the helicopter rotors would force the air down onto the ice, and it would bounce back up again. So that would give him like double lift. And he was counting on this to stay aloft. But the problem was that every time he went over a crevasse, the wind would go down into the crevasse, and he would lose his double lift. And we actually saw him coming in and then bouncing as he came. Every time he went over a crevasse, the helicopter bounced and skidded on the ice and came back up again. And then one of our climbers got what I consider an absolutely brilliant idea. He was carrying pink Kool-Aid in his pack. And he took out the Kool-Aid and marked out a line between the crevasses. You can't see the crevasses from the helicopter. He squiggled out a line of Kool-Aid to allow the pilot to come in on this line to avoid the crevasses and land in a safe spot. And he did. It worked. The pilot came in. He didn't actually land. What they do is they hover just a couple of inches above the ice, because if they land, their skids can get caught, can get frozen into the ice, and they can't get out. So he just sort of hovers a couple of inches above, and we got up to him with Beck and Makalu. Makalu was a little worse off than Beck, and to Beck's credit, Beck said, take Makalu first. We put Makalu, we loaded him into the helicopter, and I was carrying a little purse of Makalu's personal effects. And after we loaded Makalu in, I tossed that purse onto Makalu's stomach. And the pilot took the purse and tossed it right back out again. He didn't want to take 1 ounce more than he had to take. So he lifted off with Makalu, took him from 21,000 feet down to base camp at 17, unloaded Makalu, came back up to 21,000, picked up Beck, loaded him in, brought him down to 17, and at 17 he had enough air for his helicopter, so he reloaded Makalu and took off with both of them off to Kathmandu. And they arrived in a helicopter in Kathmandu before the rest of us even got back to base camp. So we down climbed all the way to base camp, and we were all in a daze. It was an experience we really couldn't comprehend. We sort of walked around the camp like zombies for days, not even saying hello to each other, just sort of with our own thoughts. No one could really grasp the tragedy that had just occurred on the mountain. So after a couple of days, we decided to get together at Scott Fisher's camp and hold a memorial service. The Sherpas believe that juniper smoke is holy. So they built an altar and burned some juniper branches and let the smoke come all over the camp. And then they sat on the rocks and put their prayer books on top of oxygen crates and sung their prayers and chanted, and we all gathered around. And then when they finished chanting, each of the climbers that wanted to would come up onto the higher rocks and then speak from their hearts. they would turn to the mountain and talk to the climbers that were still up there. Each climber said what they wanted to say, and then there was a long silence. And then Lap Song, who was Scott Fisher's longtime friend and his head Sherpa, got up. And in broken English, he said, "I tried, and I tried, and I tried, but I couldn't save him." None of us could save them. That's Scott Fisher. Scott said he wasn't feeling well on summit day, but we all say, well, Scott is Scott. You know, he'll be okay. Scott disappeared somewhere above Camp 4. This is Rob Hall. He was one of the most, or not maybe the most respected mountaineer, high mountain mountaineer in the world at that time. He had been my friend for 10 years. We'd climbed together in Antarctica. And Rob died because he refused to abandon a dying climber. And I would have expected no less from Rob. That was the kind of guy he was. And there's Andy Harris. Andy Harris was Rob's chief guide. Andy got lost in the whiteout. He missed the camp by only a few yards and stepped off the sheer east face of Everest. And then Doug Hansen. Doug and I had climbed together the year before, and Doug had gotten some frostbite, and I took care of him, and we both said how lucky he was because the frostbite was minor, and he'd be able to climb again. But this year, his luck ran out. And then there was Yasuko Namba, the Japanese climber. She had summited and collapsed in the snow. And one of the other climbers, my friend Neil Beidelman, came across her. Neil was already dragging 2 other climbers to safety. And Yasuko tagged onto him. And Neil started dragging 3 climbers down as best he could toward Camp 4. And he said he felt Yasuko slip off, but he didn't have the strength to pick her up. These are Tibetan prayer flags. The Sherpas believe that if you write prayers on these flags, the wind will carry them up to the gods. But that year, Everest wasn't listening. Thank you, that's it.
So, how long has it been? 21 years?
Since that, I think it's 21 years, yeah.
And when did you start getting over it?
When did I start what? Getting over it? You know what? I have times when I get over it and times when it affects me again. You know, sometimes I can tell the story without thinking that deeply, but sometimes it really gets me. You know, every year I've gone to Everest, there's been deaths on the mountain, but this was the first year that it was people I knew. You know,
Yeah.
so it strikes me quite
Obviously
different.
close friends. Obviously you spend months and months and months together.
Yeah.
You know, what is there a protocol that you go through from base camp as to when you turn back, or I mean, what are the guidelines, or the as to say, look, this is stupid, we're not going to do this?
Yeah. Well, there are guidelines actually, but every team sets their own guidelines. You have what you call turnaround times. If you're not at a certain point on the mountain at a certain time of the day, then you turn around, no matter how good you feel. And that was my situation on Everest in '95. The year before that, like the picture I showed where I was up on the summit ridge, and we were 900 feet from the summit. And it was actually a beautiful day. The sun was out, there was no wind, but it had been snowing very heavily for the entire week before then. And the snow had sort of compacted into a crystalline kind of formation, which didn't really hold tightly. It was like we were walking in a sugar bowl. We were taking one step and then another step and not being able to form a track around us. So ordinarily, there were 9 of us. In those days, there was hardly anybody on the mountain. We were nine of us were the only team up there. And we were breaking trail, each one of us, because the trail wouldn't hold. So ordinarily, you take turns breaking trail, one and then another, so you can rest a little bit. But this was like each one of us was breaking trail each time we took a step. And it was exhausting, and it was slow. And because the ice was that crystal-y kind of sugary thing, we couldn't fix our ice screws very well in the ice. So we were moving very slowly. It was dangerous because we didn't have the ice screws. And even though it was 11 o'clock in the morning, we decided to turn around because we calculated that we didn't have enough oxygen or enough time to get to the summit and get back down and still have oxygen and still have daylight. So even though there were 9 of us and we were all in good shape, but it was a unanimous decision to turn around because we just respected our turnaround time.
I hate to ask a gruesome question, but, you know, what happens to all these people?
Well, people
I
ask
mean,
that all the time.
there's hundreds of people up there, right?
Well, not hundreds, no, there are some. It's not, people have gruesome picture, which really isn't accurate. Mostly the bodies are brought down. The ones that can't be brought down are put in a crevasse or something else. You don't step over bodies when you go to Everest. It's not like that.
What's the success rate of a summit?
Well, now it's gotten a lot higher. Sort of sad to say, after that disaster, Everest became a trophy for a lot of people who don't belong on the mountain. So now you get literally hundreds of people going up and summiting. They've made it, the guides, it's very financially advantageous for the Nepalese government and for the companies that run these groups to get people to the top. So now they have fixed ropes almost all the way up. They have more oxygen. So the success rate has gotten a lot higher. It used to be 1 in 8. I don't know what it is now.
So you go 8 times, one person go?
For every 8 people who try, 1 makes it. But that's probably an old statistic. It's probably a lot more now.
Yeah, I mean, because you do hear of, it's almost become a...
It's, I see that, honestly, I have to say, it's not too strong a word to say it's sickening to see what's going on there now. You have a lot of people who don't belong on a mountain, and there are lines to go up to the summit. Like I said, in '95, when I was up near the summit, there was nobody else on the summit ridge. We were the only team up there, 9 of us. And now you see pictures, there's a line of people waiting to get up to the summit, So it's really changed radically.
So
it's not really a mountain climber's place anymore.
There's not very many mountain climbers here, but
Yeah.
why and when did you decide you want to climb mountains? Why?
Well, the when is a long time ago. When I was a kid, I was a precocious reader, and I picked up this book called Annapurna. And I picked it up only because it was a funny word, and I didn't know what the word meant. And it turned out that Annapurna is a famous mountain in Nepal, and at the time this book was written, it was the highest mountain ever climbed. It was a classic mountaineering story. And that got me interested in mountaineering. I grew up in the Bronx in New York in a housing project, and it's like nothing could be more opposite to my situation than these vast mountains in the Himalayas. So I always had this idea I wanted to do that, I just kept it within me till I didn't start climbing until I was an intern in medical school. But I always felt like I wanted to do that. It's something, and I finally got my chance to do it, and I really took it on. I really loved it because what climbing does is it puts you face to face with the elements. This is what the real attraction of climbing. All of a sudden, the important things in life become food, water, warmth, friendship, shelter. These things become what your life is all about, and it's like a real intense way to live. It makes you, when you come back and you start thinking, I'm late for a meeting or I'm stuck in traffic, it sounds so ridiculously trivial, compared to these major things that you need to do to stay alive. So it's nice to go back to the mountains to renew that feeling every once in a while. And it's very hard. Mountain climbing is very hard. So it pushes you to your limits. And when you take on a challenge like that, you find that there's qualities within you that you never knew you had, and that would otherwise be dormant in you your entire life if you didn't push yourself in some direction. It doesn't have to be mountain climbing. Like I like to say, everybody should have their own Everest. It doesn't have to be a mountain. It can be just some project, like building a hospital. Some project that you take on and it's going to be hard, but you really push yourself to do it. And when you succeed, it's great. And even if you don't succeed, you've brought out qualities in yourself that will last you the rest of your life.
So, I do understand the ambition of doing virtually what seems to me to be impossible.
Yeah, well,
This would be, to
like
to
you.
me, it would be impossible.
Like building a hospital.
It would be an impossible a task. I do understand that sense of potential accomplishment in doing it and the sense of challenge. And, you know, having had myself at times the fortune to have adventures, I'll say, that were, I thought at the time, fairly dangerous, but nothing like this. I partially understand. I partially understand. I just don't understand getting outside of an airliner, an aircraft, an airliner.
Yeah.
Basically, you're at 30,000 feet. I mean,
Yeah.
you're stepping outside of you know, a 747 and saying, I'm going to go down this rock or up this rock. I never had that ambition, and I admire you, and I admire all the people that were able over the last half century to century, since 54, 53, when he first summited. So,
I have to say,
please.
what reminded me, the first time I came into Nepal in the airplane, there was a cloud cover, a whole carpet of cloud, and the one thing sticking up out of the cloud was the summit of Everest. And I really said to myself, this is ridiculous. You know, how can anybody stand at that point? You know, there's nothing there. I mean, the clouds are lower.
So anyway, I hope you all understand that this physician was the real hero of the 96 expedition. He was featured in the book and movie as the hero of the salvation of the people that were able to be salvaged, basically, that were at death's door. And I think we should give him a hero's ovation. So thank you very much.